It starts with a contradiction that's hard to ignore. The louder the denial, the quieter the room gets. Because when a story refuses to die, when it keeps resurfacing in whispers, in side comments, in carefully worded non-answers, you have to ask why. Not whether it's true yet, just why it's still here. Why it's being handled the way it is. Why so many people seem nervous about saying the wrong thing. This isn't about salacious details. Not yet, and maybe not ever. This is about power, reputation, and what happens when a carefully constructed public image collides with a past that refuses to stay neatly archived. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, the public has been trained to see celebrity narratives in extremes. Victim or villain, truth or smear, empowerment or exploitation. But real life doesn't work like that. It's messier, quieter, full of half-truths and strategic silences. And tonight's story lives entirely in that gray space. Because what happens when an old relationship, long dismissed as irrelevant, suddenly becomes relevant again. When someone who once stayed quiet begins to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to shift the temperature in the room. That's where things get uncomfortable. There's a reason former partners are often dismissed as bitter before they even open their mouths. It's efficient. It protects the present by discrediting the past. But it also avoids a harder question. What if the reason someone stayed silent before wasn't lack of truth, but timing? What if silence was a strategy? This story matters now because of timing, because of context, because of what's happening elsewhere. Lawsuits, brand collapses, sudden pivots, controlled interviews that feel rehearsed a beat too carefully. Because when pressure builds from multiple directions, old doors have a way of creaking open. And here's where the tension really sits. Not in the claim itself, but in the reaction to it. Watch closely. Who responds immediately? Who doesn't respond at all? Who frames the narrative before anyone else can? And who suddenly becomes very careful with their words? Ask yourself this. If nothing here mattered, why handle it so delicately? There's also something else at play. Labels. The way certain stereotypes get deployed quickly, almost lazily, to shut down nuance. Especially when the subject is a woman. Especially when her past intersects with male-dominated spaces, power structures, or celebrity ecosystems that protect their own. Those labels aren't accidental. They're tools. And tools are only used when there's something to defend. We're not here to convict anyone. We're here to follow the thread. To slow the story down instead of letting it explode and vanish in a 24-hour outrage cycle. To examine how narratives are built and unbuilt, piece by piece. Because once you start pulling at this thread, you realize it's attached to something much larger than one person's past. And the next detail, the one people keep dancing around, changes the tone entirely. The first thing that changes when a long-buried story resurfaces isn't the headline. It's behavior. People start hedging. Statements become conditional. Phrases like, "to my knowledge," and "that's not how I remember it," suddenly appear where certainty used to live. And if you're paying attention, you notice something else too, the absence of outright denial. That's always telling. Because in genuine smear campaigns, denial comes fast and loud. Lawyers issue statements within hours. Representatives shut things down with clean, surgical language. There's confidence in the dismissal. That's not what happens here. Instead, what we see is hesitation, careful distancing, a noticeable shift from personal storytelling to corporate phrasing, as if someone, somewhere, is reminding everyone involved to stick to approved language. Why? This is where the timeline matters. The relationship at the center of this story existed long before the current public identity took shape, before rebrands, before curated vulnerability, before the narrative solidified into something marketable and protected. Back then, there were fewer filters, fewer incentives to control perception, fewer consequences for telling the truth or staying quiet. And that silence lasted a long time, which raises an uncomfortable question. Why now? People love to assume motivation without evidence. Revenge, jealousy, money, attention. It's easier than grappling with the possibility that timing, not intent, is the catalyst. That sometimes people speak because circumstances finally make it possible or necessary to do so. Here's the contradiction. If the past truly had no relevance, it wouldn't trigger such a coordinated response in the present. Yet it does. And not because of what's being said, but because of what it threatens to reframe. Public personas are fragile ecosystems. They rely on consistency, on the illusion that every chapter of a life leads neatly to the next. When an old story introduces chaos, especially one that complicates morality instead of clarifying it, the entire structure wobbles. This is why certain details are being avoided. Not denied. Avoided. Notice how discussions quickly shift away from specifics and toward character, toward framing the speaker rather than the substance, toward emotional tone rather than factual sequence. It's a classic maneuver. Discredit the messenger before the message takes shape. But here's the problem. The message isn't coming all at once. It's leaking. Quietly. Indirectly. Through side comments, corroborating anecdotes, and moments where people say too much before realizing they shouldn't have said anything at all. And the audience feels that tension instinctively, because you can sense when something is being managed instead of addressed. Ask yourself, if the story were harmless, why handle it like volatile material? There's also a deeper discomfort here, one that isn't being acknowledged publicly. The way certain narratives rely on rewriting adulthood as innocence and ambition as victimhood. When an earlier version of a person doesn't fit that arc, it creates narrative dissonance. And dissonance is dangerous in a brand-driven identity. This chapter isn't about proving anything. It's about observing the cracks, the pauses, the moments where language tightens and spontaneity disappears, where people who once spoke freely suddenly sound like they're reading from an invisible script. Because the next phase of this story doesn't come from accusation. It comes from comparison. And when past accounts start lining up with present behavior, the implications get harder to ignore. Here's where the story stops being about what was said and starts becoming about patterns. Because once you step back, once you stop fixating on the most provocative fragments and instead look at behavior over time, something familiar emerges. A rhythm, a repetition. The same moves resurfacing in different rooms, with different audiences, under different circumstances. At first, it feels coincidental. Everyone reinvents themselves. Everyone edits their past. That's normal. That's human. But then you notice how often reinvention requires erasure. Not just of events, but of witnesses. Former friends fade out of the narrative. Old colleagues are never mentioned. Entire chapters are summarized in vague, non-threatening language. I was figuring myself out. It was a confusing time. I wasn't being protected. Those phrases sound empathetic. Reasonable, even. Until you realize they also do something else. They flatten complexity. They remove agency. They transform choice into circumstance. And that's when the contradictions begin to stack. Because the earlier version of this story, the one told privately, long before cameras and contracts, doesn't sound uncertain. It sounds strategic, ambitious, intentional, not reckless, not victimized. Directed. So which version is real? The one that existed before reputation management mattered? Or the one that emerged after everything was on the line? This is where the discomfort sharpens, especially for anyone who's worked around celebrity ecosystems. Because these aren't random inconsistencies. They're familiar tells. The kind you see when someone learns, over time, which parts of their story generate sympathy, and which parts invite scrutiny. And once that learning happens, it rarely stops. Ask yourself this. Why do certain environments keep repeating? Why do the same social circles, industries, and power structures show up again and again in the background, while the official narrative insists each phase was separate, accidental, unconnected? Patterns don't accuse. They suggest. And suggestions are harder to silence. This is also where labeling becomes useful, not to explain behavior, but to shut conversation down. Reduce a complex adult history into a stereotype. A caricature, something dismissible, something unserious. Once a label sticks, nuance dies. And nuance is dangerous when you're trying to keep people from asking follow-up questions. Here's another thing that doesn't get said out loud. When someone has truly been misrepresented, they usually want clarity, details, corrections, chronology. They want the record clean. But when someone avoids specifics, when they lean instead on emotion, outrage, or moral framing, it often signals a different priority. Control, not truth. Narrative dominance, not resolution. Watch how carefully certain questions are never answered. Not even indirectly. Not, that didn't happen. But why are we talking about this? Not, that's false. But this is harmful. Those are not the same statements. And audiences feel the difference, even if they can't always articulate it. Because by now, this story isn't really about the past anymore. It's about what the past threatens to expose about the present. About how much of the current identity relies on selective memory, and how fragile that structure becomes when the wrong comparison is made. And in the next section, that comparison arrives. Not from accusations, but from timelines that suddenly don't line up. Timelines are unforgiving. They don't care about intention. They don't respond to emotion. They simply sit there, quiet and stubborn, waiting for someone to line events up honestly. And once that happens, things get awkward. Because when you map public statements against documented appearances, when you place interviews next to dates, movements, and affiliations, a subtle misalignment appears. Not dramatic enough to scream lie. Not clean enough to dismiss as coincidence either. Just enough to unsettle. This is where seasoned observers start leaning forward. Because the issue isn't one missing detail. It's accumulation. A series of small inconsistencies that, on their own, feel harmless, but together begin to suggest careful editing. A story trimmed not for accuracy, but for effect. Notice how certain years are rushed through, while others are lingered on. How some relationships are framed as formative, while others vanish entirely. How motivation is emphasized in one era, then mysteriously absent in another. Ask yourself, why do some chapters get names, while others are reduced to blur? This is especially noticeable when overlapping timelines are involved. When one professional milestone quietly overlaps with a personal transition. When an introduction through a friend coincides with access to a completely new circle. When proximity becomes opportunity, but the narrative insists it was accidental. Those overlaps don't prove wrongdoing, but they do challenge the idea of randomness. And randomness is a pillar of innocence narratives. There's also the matter of who corroborates what and when. Early accounts from different people, given years apart, start echoing each other in unexpected ways. Not identical stories, not rehearsed, but aligned in tone, in implication, in what they choose not to emphasize. That's often more revealing than perfect agreement. Because people who are lying tend to over-coordinate. People who are recalling tend to overlap organically. Another detail worth sitting with, the emotional temperature of the responses. When timelines are questioned, you'd expect frustration, maybe indignation. What you don't usually expect is panic-adjacent urgency. The sudden push to reframe the entire conversation. The pivot from facts to feelings. That pivot matters. It suggests the threat isn't exposure, it's comparison. Because once audiences start comparing who someone said they were then with who they say they are now, the illusion of linear growth collapses. Growth becomes revision. Empowerment becomes retroactive justification. And suddenly, the past isn't just inconvenient. It's destabilizing. This is why certain documents, messages, or witnesses are never addressed directly. Why the conversation keeps getting dragged back to tone, fairness, and harm. Those are important topics. But notice how they're used here, as shields. Because as long as we're arguing about whether it's appropriate to ask questions, we're not asking them. And the most dangerous questions in this story are the quiet ones. The ones that don't accuse. The ones that simply ask, does this version actually align with the record? And here's the thing. Once that question enters the room, it doesn't leave. Even if nothing else comes out. Even if no one ever confirms anything definitively. The doubt lingers. Not as scandal, but as skepticism. And skepticism is harder to extinguish than outrage. Because outrage burns fast. Skepticism waits. And what's coming next doesn't rely on memory, interpretation, or motive at all. It relies on something much colder. Something written down. There's a moment in every long-running public narrative where the noise fades and something colder takes its place. Not outrage. Not loyalty. Record. Because once things are written down, once they exist outside memory, emotion, or framing, they change the rules of the conversation. And that's where this story quietly lands. Up to now, everything has lived in interpretation, in tone, in reaction, in the spaces between what was said and what wasn't. That ambiguity has protected everyone involved. It's allowed supporters to defend, critics to speculate, and institutions to stay comfortably silent. But documents don't speculate. They don't care how a story feels. They don't respond to moral framing. They just sit there, waiting to be read in the order they were created. And that's why so much effort goes into keeping attention elsewhere. Because once timelines harden into records, the narrative stops being flexible. This doesn't mean there's a single explosive reveal waiting. Real investigations rarely work that way. What's more destabilizing is incremental clarity, small confirmations, mundane details that quietly contradict the polished version of events. That's how reputations actually shift, not with scandal, but with recalibration. Think about what we've really been watching unfold. Not an accusation war, not a character assassination, but a slow tension between image and continuity, between who someone says they were and what the surrounding evidence suggests they were doing. And here's the part that's hardest to sit with. None of this requires anyone to be purely good or purely bad. It only requires the possibility that the public story has been simplified for survival. That's an uncomfortable idea because it implicates